The Spanish-American War is very often forgotten, especially from a European perspective, where it is overshadowed by World War I and its lead-up. But, especially for the nations which fought it, this war was quite influential. It showed the US as a growing superpower, ready to put their stamp on a region they considered their backyard. While it also showed a Spanish Empire that was on the brink of losing their final holdings on a continent they had once dominated. So, what was the Spanish-American War? Well, the peoples of Cuba had been yearning and fighting for their independence for decades, fighting off and on conflicts, one of which starting in 1895. For about 3 years, they fought a guerrilla campaign against the Spanish, and it began to capture the imagination of the American media. This was the age of mass media, of gossip, of the Yellow Pages. They massively reported on Spanish conduct in Cuba, publishing exaggerated accounts of very real Spanish war crimes with the explicit goal of fomenting an armed conflict. And the public was getting riled up. But still, neither of the governments actually wanted war. American President McKinley was pressured into action, but began diplomatically. He sought to mediate the two sides, hoping to secure autonomy for Cuba within the Spanish Empire. The Spanish, likewise, had no interest to see the US join this war, and so they agreed to these negotiations and had drafted a constitution for Cuba and Puerto Rico. They also replaced Governor General Weyler, who undertook harsh methods like displacements in hope of suppressing the revolt. Yet, the rebels refused to negotiate. But McKinley's hand would be forced by riots in Havana, Cuba's capital. The local American consul expressed concerns about the safety of the Americans there, so the USS Maine was sent to keep them safe. Soon after, the ship exploded. The cause is unknown, though nowadays it is thought to have been an internal combustion. But to the American media and the public, the culprit was unquestioningly an aggressive Spain. Another round of calls for war intensified, while Spain, once more, tried to appease the Americans, but the rebels kept refusing any negotiations. McKinley himself remained opposed to war, but he was increasingly alone. The overwhelming public pressure was seeping through into Congress and his administration. Especially with the midterms approaching and his own re-election being only 2 years away, he felt it would be political suicide not to act now. Congress voted in favor of war, with the explicit justification of liberating, not conquering Cuba. The war would be over within a year, as the newly modernized and expanded American Navy wiped the floor with the Spanish, who were spread thin on the defensive on 3 continents. By the end of the war, the US indeed liberated Cuba, though secured their influence through a protectorate, while directly seizing Puerto Rico and the far-off Philippines and Guam, cementing the US as a modern imperialist power. Now, upon hearing all this, you may not be surprised when I say that this war might have been easily avoided. The Spanish recognized the risk of American entry, while the US president likewise preferred not to get involved. At various points, the rebels may have compromised with Spain. The Maine may have never been sent or never exploded, allowing Spain more time to consolidate, especially politically. Importantly, the war had also begun under the leadership of the liberals, who were generally willing to consider autonomy for the colonies. They were then replaced by the conservatives, who took a harsher stance towards the war, seeking to restore order by force. In 1898, the liberals were again restored to power, but as mentioned before, they failed to sort out a compromise with the rebels. The liberals may have the best shot at resolving, if not preventing this conflict, by offering Cuba representation and autonomy within Spain sooner. Now, the specifics of how or when Spain resolved the conflict aren't all too relevant. More important is that, with the conflict over, the American mass media will lack the fuel to fan the flames of conflict, and McKinley has his preferred diplomatic solution to the conflict. So, what has now actually concretely changed? Well, let us start with the most well-known figure of the era, Teddy Roosevelt, nicknamed the Colonel. His rise to power was truly remarkable. During McKinley's first administration, he had been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, albeit a rather influential one on account of John Long, the actual secretary, being sickly and uninterested. But the war against Spain launched his career into orbit. He resigned from his post and formed a cavalry regiment to fight in Cuba, closely followed by the press, who dubbed them the Rough Riders. And Roosevelt was turned into a national hero overnight. Upon his return from the States, he was recruited by Thomas Platt, a Republican political mogul, to run for governor of New York. Colonel Roosevelt ran explicitly on his war successes, and won the election by only 1% of the vote. During his time as governor, Roosevelt was rather successful and popular, while Garrett Hobart, McKinley's vice president, died in 1899, leaving an open spot on the ticket for McKinley's re-election. Roosevelt didn't want to roll, but the media machine ramped up a campaign regardless, and he was overwhelmingly supported as vice presidential candidate. Roosevelt entered the campaign with energy, undoubtedly contributing to McKinley's even more decisive second victory. Only 6 months later, McKinley was shot, and Roosevelt had become president, ready to make his mark on history through trust busting while dominating national politics for decades afterwards. So to recap, within 2 years, Roosevelt went from an unknown Under-Secretary of the Navy to one of the most influential presidents of the century. While his undeniable competence and energy may have carried him far in this alternate timeline anyways, it is undeniable that his route to power was swift and based on a lot of luck. Without the popularity from the war in Cuba, he could have never ran for governor of New York in 1898, and even if he had, he would have lost. And it is very unlikely anybody would be thinking of this undersecretary when debating the 1900s VP candidate. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now I don't think I need to tell you, but Roosevelt was immensely influential on US politics. While McKinley was not as extremely conservative as sometimes claimed, he did lean towards the pro-business wing of the Republican Party, far less invested in progressive ideals as Roosevelt was. Then, even without Roosevelt, McKinley will still win the 1900s election. And that raises questions. Does McKinley still get shot, or has that, by pure coincidence, been butterflied away? If he is shot, who is his alternate VP, and how would they fare as president? Annoyingly, this absolutely crucial question, which may decide an alternate president, is near impossible to answer. There is a long list of plausible candidates, the strongest being Jonathan Dolliver, who was a progressive, but not to the extent of Roosevelt, far from the aggressive bull moose we saw historically. He was considered a favorite before Roosevelt came into the picture. Another option is Charles Fairbank, a conservative, safe pick, preferred by the Republican establishment, who would essentially offer a continuation of McKinley's presidency. Beyond these are various other dark horse options, like Elihu Root, a moderate in the party, Cornelius Bliss, a business elite himself, or John Long, a personal friend to McKinley without all too strong convictions. All of these options may lead to a different USA in subtle ways, but even the most progressive of them all didn't come close to matching Teddy Roosevelt in energy and stance. Now regardless, don't think that if a business-friendly Republican wins, progressivism never sees its day in the USA, the Gilded Age never ends, and the US is bought up by Standard Oil in its totality. Even before full trust busting, the US government was slowly starting to regulate the major companies. Journalists were reporting on the abuses of corporations and government, and progressives were gaining traction amongst both parties in the US. But the ideology doesn't make its splashing entrance into the mainstream, and it is an open question who, if anyone, becomes the first major progressive president. But then let's dive into Spain a bit. For them, this war was likewise impactful. The trauma from the war is referred to as the disaster of 1898, having an immense effect amongst its elites. From it emerged the generation of 98, who, through literary and intellectual movements, sought to renew Spain after the loss of empire. Over time, the political divides in the nation radicalized. The left began to call for more radical reforms. The liberals demanded a republican and true democracy, while the right turned to staunch conservatism and religion, arguing national strength and military power were needed for national revival. There were also some amongst the military who felt that the liberal government had betrayed them during the war, which had caused the defeat. Now, this war did not create these factions, but they did radicalize elements of them, setting them off against each other more. During this period, Spain had an incredibly corrupt democracy, in which the liberals and conservatives had agreed to take turns winning, rigging the votes to make it so. But this system was already showing cracks. During the reign of Afonso, we saw several cabinets falling prematurely, political assassinations, and increased interference from the monarch into politics. Meanwhile, a group of the military, known as the Africanistas, became obsessed with finding new colonies in Africa, leading to several wars with Morocco, which caused discontent amongst anti-war Spaniards. These Africanistas would radicalize towards the right and later lead the ultra-nationalist takeover. Now, World War I actually offered a short period of respite for Spain. Their neutrality had led to economic recovery, but also a serious crash when the war ended. Revolutionary tensions rose, while the king broadly gave up on liberalism, condoning a coup from General Primo de Rivera, who formed a dictatorship. Once that dictatorship almost bankrupted the nation, the people were fed up with the monarchy as a whole, and after a massive electoral loss, the monarchy was abolished and a republic was declared. Only 5 years later, this republic would erupt into the Spanish Civil War. Now, without the Spanish-American War, we may very well argue that these decades of extreme political instability and change could be totally removed. Most optimistically, we may see the military not be discredited and not overcompensating for lost valor in Morocco. The political system may be more stable, preventing much of the chaos of the 20th century for Spain. And importantly, the Spanish Civil War and Franco would be avoided. Perhaps such a path may offer a brighter future for Spain. But a more cynical read could be that Spain's political issues were already too deeply rooted, with an illiberal king and a dysfunctional democracy. In such a case, we could argue that while details of Spain's future would be changed, there would still be instability through revolutions, civil war, the consolidation of a military regime, or the attempted creation of a true republic. Truly, Spain's future is completely up in the air. Another interesting theater is Asia. The Spanish had extensive Asian domains, historically partially taken by the US, while the rest was sold to Germany. Now, without this war, I often see it argued that Spain will seek to get rid of these colonies anyways, selling them to either Germany or Japan. Yet, I think this underestimates how stubborn of a power Spain was during this era, They were once the foremost colonial empire. The last remnants of said empire were now a matter of principle, especially for the conservatives and the military. It was only after the disaster of 1898 that they abandoned their colonies. Beyond that, the prospective buyers are very dubious. An attempted German takeover could spark a heavy response from the Entente and Britain, who during this era had likewise confronted Germany over other colonial affairs. In regards to Japan, I think none of the Europeans would be too excited about seeing an Asiatic power openly buying up European colonies. Now there was an active Philippine independence war, much like in Cuba, which may yet shake up the region. But unlike in Cuba, the Spanish had been in a relatively good position until the US intervened. So, it would be an uphill battle for the Philippines, which could keep the Spanish militarists busy a continent away. While, once again, the surrounding colonial powers may fear allowing a native uprising to achieve independence, at least not without being significantly distracted themselves. If I had to guess, Spain could keep the territories, unless it really looks like they'll lose the independence war, at which point they may start looking for buyers. In regards to Cuba and Puerto Rico, their future largely depends on Spanish politics. Does their newly gained autonomy actually hold up, or is it later trampled upon by Madrid? If the Spanish mess up, the conflict could easily restart later, once again risking an American response. Fact is, the US were coming increasingly close to being one of the most powerful states on Earth. And regardless, factions would persist which seek to let the US prove their mettle internationally, and the Spanish would remain an attractive target for this. Across this video, we will assume no alternate Spanish-American war happens, but remember, it would be an ever-present possibility. Zooming out, the broader geopolitical situation in the lead up to World War I is tricky. It is definitely possible that we have introduced some changes, most notably with how Germany may position itself regarding Spanish colonies, but also with the fate of Morocco being up in the air and Germany historically having had interest in Morocco. For the most part though, the broader lines of the great powers aren't likely thrown into disarray by the internal changes to Spain and the USA, and we may conclude that Europe's alliances look roughly the same. So then, how is Spain doing by 1914? Would they be in any position to join a world war? Would they even be interested? If they are, who do they join? Well, it remains most likely that Spain remains neutral. Aside from minor colonial gains in Africa, there just isn't much for them to gain, and they are far away from the front lines, or they have to run up against the Pyrenees into France, while struggling greatly against Britain's navy. If, however, they decide to join, it is almost certain they join the Entente. Even before the conflict, their relations with the Entente were good, even signing an anti-German defensive pact. Joining the Germans would essentially destroy the Spanish Empire. Their holdings in Africa and Asia would be easy pickings for the British and the Japanese. Also, fighting an offensive war across the Pyrenees would be near impossible for them. If Spain joins the war, it is likely in the same capacity as Portugal, angered by German submarine warfare, and as a reward, best case, they may get some concessions around Cameroon. Perhaps more interestingly though, how may the US change the war? This can really depend on how their political theater develops. Woodrow Wilson, the historical president in 1914, decisively won because Teddy Roosevelt split the votes of the Republicans between himself and Taft. Of course, Teddy is likely nowhere near as influential, but even if he does become the nominee in 1904 or 1908, the splitting of the vote in 1912 was a result of the two-term convention for president, which wouldn't be an issue yet in this alternate 1912. Thus, whoever the Republicans nominate in 1912, they run a unified party, and we have no clue who it may be. The Democratic nominee may likewise be different, and all we really know is that whoever the Republicans nominate, they are the favorite to win, but far from guaranteed. Either way though, we have absolutely no clue who may sit in the White House in 1914, or who may win the likewise alternate 1916 election. But what we do know is that both parties were generally isolationist, opposed to US entry into the war, and that includes President Wilson as well. The American public generally had no interest in going to war, and at best, the US saw for itself a role as arbiter or financier of the Entente powers. It would take years of German atrocities in Belgium, submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and fears of the Entente being unable to pay their loans back for the US to finally join. So, I think it is mostly reasonable to suggest that the US may follow a relatively similar timetable before they join this war. After all, the historical declaration had broad support from both parties in April of 1917. But still, depending on the changes to the President and Congress, the specifics may absolutely be changed. By that point, the main change to World War I will be the changes to the peace deal itself without President Wilson, who was arguably the most influential single figure at the Paris peace treaties. He put a lot of emphasis on the fairness of the treaties and on self-determination, at least for European peoples. This was a two-edged sword, as the promises and dreams of the various nationalities had to be balanced with the reality on the ground, and on the desires of the great powers with boots on the ground. One notable example are the Germans. While their defeat was imminent in November of 1918, they surrendered based on the principles of Wilson's 14 points, making them feel even more snubbed at the peace conference, as if Wilson and the Entente had betrayed them. Without Wilson, it is very possible the Germans could fight on a while longer, and we may not see plebiscites over the future of certain regions. But instead, we may see changes like France directly annexing the Saarland, or Poland gaining more of Silesia. Though of course, such changes are dependent on whoever is the alternate president. The main question, however, remains German sentiments in the post-war world. Now beyond that, we saw Southern Europe become remarkably politically unstable after World War I. Troubled democracies spanned the region, each rocked by political and economic fallout of the conflict, and in Italy's case, relatively disappointing gains. Mussolini would seize power in Italy, Portugal got the dictatorship of Salazar, and as we discussed earlier, Spain first got a military dictatorship, and eventually instability led into a civil war. During the war, they had profited greatly from their neutrality, but its conclusion caused an immense economic crash, and this economic instability caused social tensions, which cascaded into the political sphere. Now, seeing the trend in the rest of Southern Europe, even in this alternate timeline, it is difficult to feel confident in the ability of the Spanish liberals to remain in charge. Still, rather than collapse, it might be possible we see a Spain which continues their pre-war trajectory rather than collapse. But, despite missing out on the disaster of 1898 and the Africanistas, we may instead see a military entrenching themselves in a colonial forever war in the Philippines, and Spain may still get swept up in the Southern European reactionary wave. Annoyingly, once again, a lot of options lay open for this alternate Spain. That, finally, leaves us with discussing World War II. And while on a map, it may seem this world isn't all too different, behind the scenes, the butterflies are piling up. The treaty against Germany will in some way be changed. German attitudes may have potentially been altered too. and by no means is it even guaranteed we see a World War I that is similar to our timeline. We are also unsure as to the role of Spain, and it may even be possible an earlier, more stable Spanish dictatorship does try to join the war, if the military can manage to grab power without a full civil war. This could help shift the naval balance of the conflict, making the Mediterranean more difficult for the Allies. But it could be compensated by British plans to capture the Canaries and gain more control over the Atlantic. Most of all though, I think the changes will focus on the Asian Pacific region. A lot of what we know there is now thrown into disarray. Rather than Japan or the US, Spain proudly maintains their position in the Atlantic. This completely changes the Japanese calculations for war and the bargaining position of the US. There were a number of reasons why Japan, historically, felt like they had no choice but to attack the US. The main reason, of course, is oil. The Japanese were reliant on oil imports, especially due to their war in China, and the US cut off this supply and pressured other nations into doing the same. Japan, not willing to give up on their war, began eyeing up the Dutch East Indies. But they felt like they couldn't just invade the Dutch out of fear of British, but especially American intervention. While there were war plans conceived which circumvented the American Philippines, had they been implemented, the US would get the opportunity to further reinforce the Philippines, bringing their navy into a state of readiness, and at any point they could start interfering with Japanese supply lines. All of this could give the US even more blackmail power over the Japanese. But with Spain in control of those territories, none of this is the case. The closest US base is now Hawaii, so the US has far less leverage over the Japanese. Plus, the US might not even have the power to as successfully embargo Japanese oil. But even if they do, a Japanese invasion is now not as certain to bring in the US, and the Japanese would be in a far more comfortable spot. Further adding to this, at the start of World War II, the US was still isolationist, but they happened to have a rather interventionist president. With all the changes to this timeline, it is highly unlikely FDR's presidency happens in the same manner at the same time. We could very easily have a president that is far less interested in getting the US involved. The war in Asia may well just focus on China. Or it could be a conflict in which the Allies, presuming war in Europe still happens, are in a far worse spot without American intervention. But by this point, the butterflies are becoming insurmountable. The future of this world will be decided in an alternate White House, interacting with an alternate Asia and an alternate Europe. The future of this world can go in a million directions, depending on how you argue Spanish politics and international geopolitics develop. So for now, I will conclude it here. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.